Welcome to the deep dive. When we think about the history of science, Galileo is sort of the ultimate cautionary tale, right? The scientist versus the establishment. Today, we're asking if we're living through a new version of that, a modern Galileo moment.
It's a really striking parallel and a bit of a disturbing one, frankly. In the 17th century, the conflict was between, the telescope and the church.
Right.
But today, the source material we're looking at suggests the conflict is between empirical evidence and this pervasive ideological pressure, often called cancel culture.
And what's so wild about these sources is that they're not just using Galileo as a metaphor for the past. They're arguing this is actively happening now, that it's shaping research in really fundamental areas.
Exactly. We're talking about genetics, heredity, even studies into biological sex differences.
Wow.
And the key thing here isn't just about, censoring a specific finding. It's about changing the whole game. It's altering the kinds of questions that scientists are even willing to ask in the first place.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to dig into the academic trends, the data from about 1990 to 2025, and really try to understand how these social pressures are changing the very framework of science.
Yeah.
Is ideology creating, blind spots in our search for knowledge? Okay, so let's unpack that. Before we even get to the research itself, we have to talk about the environment. Why do scientists feel this pressure to self-censor? What's changed, especially at universities?
Well, it really comes down to a measurable shift in attitudes towards speech. It's been documented pretty extensively by places like Pew Research, the Knight Foundation, even the Cato Institute. This shift is basically the engine behind what people call the chilling effect.
And what do those surveys actually show? It's not as simple as people suddenly deciding they hate free speech, is it?
Not at all. And that's the core contradiction in the data. If you look at younger generations, especially college students, two things are true at the same time. First, they overwhelmingly agree in the abstract, that universities should be places for open discussion.
That's the classic ideal of academia.
Exactly. But, and this is the big but, when you ask them about specific examples, things just flip. They're much more likely than older generations to support real restrictions, even professional consequences, for speech that's seen as offensive.
Especially if it's related to identity, race, that kind of thing.
Precisely. So what you have is a real shift in what's valued most. Group equality and psychological safety are sometimes placed above absolute freedom of expression.
And that creates a super unpredictable landscape for a researcher. The line isn't just about good data versus bad data anymore. It's about social norms that are constantly shifting.
You've hit on the exact mechanism. You can really only find out where the boundary is after you've already crossed it.
Which is terrifying if your career is on the line.
And that's what leads to self-censorship. Researchers who are working on these sensitive topics, especially anything that could be misinterpreted as, say, biological determinism, they pull back. Not because their science is bad, but because they're afraid of the social shaming, the career fallout. It makes any research into inherent biological differences a very, very high-risk move.
So you're not just trying to avoid asking the wrong question. You're trying to avoid finding the wrong answer. Okay, let's make this concrete. Let's move to our first case study, research on racial differences.
Okay.
This seems like ground zero for these concerns about genetic determinism. How has the pressure actually changed the work being done?
This is where it gets really fascinating. The bibliometric studies, where they analyze thousands of academic papers over decades, are so revealing. There's a huge study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that shows just a stunning shift between 1990 and today.
So what did the vocabulary look like back in the 90s? What were they focused on?
In that earlier period, the main words were things like race, ethnicity, racial differences. The framework was descriptive. It was about exploring biological or genetic factors that might explain differences in populations, like for certain diseases.
And what does it look like now, in the last decade or so?
The vocabulary has completely changed. The key terms are now diversity, structural racism, and health inequities. The entire framework has shifted away from internal biology to focus almost exclusively on social determinants, on institutional inequality being the root cause.
Okay, but hold on. You mentioned before that some of this pressure was good, that it helped get rid of bad, unethical science, like old studies claiming biological intelligence differences. How do we know this isn't just the price of cleaning up a field that had a lot of historical problems?
That is such a critical point, and the sources agree increased rigor and ethical standards were absolutely a positive development. But the knowledge vacuum, the negative side, that comes from a fear of asking the question in the first place, not from the rigor you use to answer it.
Can you give me an example of that vacuum? What are we not learning?
Okay, so researchers are now actively avoiding really valuable biological questions because the social risk is too high. We know, for instance, that the prevalence of certain genetic diseases, like sickle cell anemia, is concentrated in specific ancestral populations.
Which we often map onto the social construct of race, even though it's really about genetic history.
Exactly. But if a scientist today tries to study the biological basis for, say, inherited behavioral tendencies that might correlate with that same ancestry, they risk being immediately shut down and labeled. The fear of being called a racist means that entire avenues of inquiry that touch on biology are just. They're left unexplored. It's a choice to create blind spots.
That's a huge impact. So if that's what happened in race research, moving it from biology to sociology, what on earth happens when this same pressure hits the absolute core of biology itself, the concept of sex?
And that's our second case study, and it follows an almost identical path. What's interesting is that the amount of research on sex and gender actually went up. That was driven partly by NIH policies that said, you have to consider sex as a biological variable.
So they were forced to do more research on it, but the kind of research changed.
Precisely. The whole field went through this profound qualitative shift to try and manage the tension. The new emphasis became all about strictly separating sex, the biological stuff, from gender, the social identity. And the framework moved away from looking at biological essentialism and toward how social structures shape health.
So the question went from how are male and female bodies different to something more like how do social factors create different health outcomes for different genders?
You've got it. And just like with the race studies, the political risk around gender identity means that any deep dive into biological determinism, even just for physiology, gets sidestepped.
But this isn't just some abstract debate in a journal. This has to have massive, real-world consequences for medicine, for patients.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the stakes get incredibly high. The risk aversion is very real in clinical research. Scientists are avoiding studying crucial physiological sex differences because they're afraid of being accused of transphobia if their work is seen as, dismissing gender identity.
What's a concrete example of something we might be missing because of that?
We are talking about life and death medicine here. Think about cardiovascular disease. We now know women often have totally different heart attack symptoms than men's symptoms we missed for decades because all the early research was on men.
Right.
The effort to catch up on that is now being slowed down by this chilling effect. We also see huge sex differences in cancer risks, immune responses, and maybe the most urgent one is drug metabolism.
Wait, you mean the same drug, same dose, can affect a male body and a female body in completely different ways?
Exactly, because of differences in things like liver enzymes, body fat, hormones. But if researchers are afraid to study those biological sex differences too closely, or if they're pressured to blend sex and gender data together, then our medical data actually becomes less accurate. The effort to be socially sensitive could end up harming patients.
And that sounds like a total nightmare for anyone trying to track diseases over time. You mentioned a data integrity problem, too.
Yes. The foundational data itself is at risk. There's this huge debate now over whether public health records or long-term studies should record biological sex or gender identity. And if that basic variable becomes unstable, if you can't track it consistently over decades, you basically destroy your ability to understand long-term disease patterns. How do you track prostate cancer rates over 40 years if you don't have a stable biological denominator?
Okay, let's connect the dots. We got two huge fields, race and sex, and they're both showing the same pattern. Ideology is shifting the entire framework of research. So, what does this mean for the future of science?
It means the core problem is structurally identical to Galileo's. It's objective inquiry running up against a social orthodoxy that you just can't question. The fundamental change we've seen in both cases is a shift in what's called the locus of causality.
Okay, that's a bit academic. Break that down for us. What do you mean by that?
Think of it like a flashlight. The research flashlight has been deliberately pointed away from internal factors, biology, genetics, physiology, and pointed almost exclusively at external ones, society, institutions, power structures. The cause of any problem is always framed as being out there, not in here.
So the old question was something like, what are the intrinsic differences between groups? And the new, safer question is, what external social structures are causing these different outcomes?
That's the shift in a nutshell. And look, correcting for historical bias was necessary. That was progress. But this complete avoidance of the biological side is the new danger. Are we just swapping one kind of determinism for another, swapping biological for sociological?
This is where it gets really deep. You mentioned there's a term for this ultimate danger. What was it?
It's called epistemological closure. It's what happens when the answer is assumed before you even start the research. If the paradigm itself states that all disparities are caused by social structures, it's no longer science, it's dogma. It undermines the entire exploratory spirit of science.
Because at its heart, science has to allow for the possibility that you're wrong. And if the hypothesis that only external factors matter can't be questioned, then it's not science anymore.
Precisely. You're creating a self-imposed boundary on what truths you're even allowed to find, just to avoid politically uncomfortable answers. The modern Galileo isn't fighting a church. They're fighting a social consensus that tells them which questions are safe to ask.
That's a really powerful way to put it. So this deep dive shows a chilling effect that is systematically pushing research away from biology and towards sociology. And in doing so, it's creating huge, possibly dangerous blind spots in our knowledge, even as it's trying to improve ethics.
The conclusion from all this, really, is that the scientific community needs to build what you might call institutional resilience. It has to find a way to correct the mistakes of the past, while, at the same time, fiercely defending independent, evidence-based inquiry, even when it's uncomfortable. It's the only way forward.
And the sources offer one final and pretty provocative thought to build on that. Given how systemic this pressure is, they suggest that true resilience might require a really drastic step: legislation. Actually passing laws to formally separate scientific freedom from the pressures of cancel culture.
Which leaves a massive question for you, the listener, to think about. If the institutions designed to protect free inquiry, the universities themselves, can't do it anymore, do we ask the government to step in? And what would that even mean for academic independence? It's a desperate solution for what might be a desperate problem.